This is the second presentation of a series of presentations that I teach at in the Introduction to Global Future Studies course at the Hankuk University of Foreign Studies in Seoul, Korea. My name is Professor Dennis R. Morgan, and this is for the spring of 2020 class. This particular presentation is an overview of futures and foresight methods. It's largely adapted from an overview of foresight methods by Marie Conway of the Center for Australian Foresight, and it also draws upon David A. Jarvis of Salve Regina University's presentation, Sensing the Future Environmental Scanning Techniques. And there are a few slides that are based on Sohail Inayatullah's 6 Pillars of Futures Thought. Well, I'm going to begin this presentation, and similar to the way I began the previous presentation, Introduction to Future Studies, with why foresight? I mean, what is foresight and why is it important? Well, and again, I want to do that by situating it within the time frame of the future in comparison to the other two time frames, the past and the present. And I think from there we can better answer that question. So let's begin with the past. Typically we study the past through historical studies. But what do we know about that? Well, for one thing, we're certain about what happened. I mean, we have evidence, documents, eyewitnesses, that can say, well, this is a fact. So we're pretty certain about that. Now, maybe there's some differences in interpretation about what happened, and there are, of course, we decide what's important and what's not important, and so on. But nevertheless, there are the fundamental facts that cannot be changed, and we have a lot of data. Most of historical studies is sifting through the data to determine, again, what's important and what's not important. But still, the data is there. And what's important? I mean, why is it important? Well, to study history? Well, one thing, we can learn about the past so that we avoid repeating those mistakes today. Ideally, that is. That's not always what happens. Sometimes we do repeat the same mistakes because they appear in a different guise. But nevertheless, that's the idea. I think there's another more important reason, perhaps, is that historical studies help us to understand more about ourselves. In other words, it helps form our identity. It comes from our culture, and we're born into that culture, and that tells us who we are on the basis of, our people, certain people within a tribe or a community or a nation. And it helps us to understand, like where we came from, and this is who I am. Well, now what about the present? How is that different from the past? Well, and as I mentioned before, typically we study the present through the media, and it helps us to try to understand what's going on in the world. Things are changing. Things are moving around. So we're not so certain of what happened because it's not finished yet. It's still happening. And so we try to make sense of what's happening in the present. And because it's still happening, unlike history where we can't really change it, but in the present we can change it because we can respond to it in real time. We can shape and influence it. But similar to the past, there's a lot of data. We could say even today, being in the information society, we have what's called data overload. But why is it important? Well, in the present is situated between the past and the future, and we use the past based on our experience in the past of interpreting events. We use that, and history. We use that to inform the strategic decisions that we make today. And similarly, we can use the future to inform strategic decisions that we make today. Now, how do we do that? I think we could do that through the way we engage with the future. The more experience we have of understanding the future, and then what are the possibilities, the probabilities, what are our plans, what do we want, our engagement with that helps us to make the decisions that we make today because we're expecting a certain outcome in the future. And that brings us to the future itself. What's different about that time frame? Well, for one thing, it hasn't happened yet. We're we're uncertain, unlike the past where we're certain. In the future, we're uncertain. And whereas in the present, we're kind of certain, but not completely. But in the future, but that also helps us to understand that we have a lot more flexibility than the other two time frames to shape and influence the future because it hasn't happened yet. So that's one of the advantages of foresight studies, that we gives us this opportunity to shape and influence the future. Now, we don't have any data, but except that we borrow from the past and the present. And why is it important? Well, for one thing, and similar to the present, is that we can learn from the future to avoid, and like the past, where we want to avoid repeating mistakes today, in the future we want to avoid making mistakes. So how can we learn from the future? Well, again, this is futures consciousness. And the more we develop it, the more we use it, we see what works and we see what doesn't work, and the methods that we employ. And through the development of consciousness itself. So it's like a muscle. And the more we exercise it, the better we get. So we can learn from the future in that respect. And we can avoid making mistakes because we can see what the possible mistakes are. And we can either avoid them, or at least we can learn how to minimize them so that they're not really have so much of an impact as they normally would if those mistakes took us by surprise. So that's the reason why foresight is important. So I want to turn our attention now to some typical approaches to the future. And one of them is that, and this is typical even in future studies itself, so we talk about the baseline future, trend extrapolation from history and so on, thinking that tomorrow is just going to be more like today or yesterday, This is called the linear future. And actually, most of the time it's true. The problem is it's not always true. And when it's not true, then we're not prepared for the unexpected, or the unfamiliar. So when the linear future doesn't happen, we don't know what to do, because we didn't think about that, we didn't prepare for that. So that's another problem, or more of a typical approach to the future. Now let's look at some other approaches too that are similarly problematic. For one thing, we don't usually systematically or deeply explore the long-term future, 10 to 20 years out. It's almost unheard of. You just don't do it. At the most, it's usually 5 years. Now, why not? Because I think if we thought more about the long term, the long future, we could have some impact maybe on creating a more desirable or preferred future for future generations. So we need to be able to learn how to identify what are the possible futures 10 to 20 years now, and that could have some impact on some of the policies that we create in the present if we knew, if we were able to explore some of the opportunities or threats that might exist. And then another thing is that, and this is sort of a paradigm problem, is that we prefer quantitative over qualitative information. This is typical of the scientific paradigm of the modernity, where it's very materialistic, and only numbers count. And if you can't quantify it, it doesn't exist. It's very reductionist in that respect. And but it's kind of blind. For example, we know that consciousness exists, We can't really quantify it, but we know it exists. I mean, there's so much of our reality that we assume, of the more of an internal nature, you might say, that exists. It has an impact in our lives, and we behave according to it. And yet, we can't really just say it doesn't exist, this can lead to a blindness, and then it can be a huge mistake if you just ignore the qualitative information. So you have to find the right balance between quantitative and qualitative information. And another typical approach revolves around assumptions. Don't challenge individual and organizational assumptions about the future. Well, first of all, we have to recognize we all have assumptions about the future. All of us do. And our assumptions will largely determine the direction that we go in and the future that we realize. So if we have to be aware of our assumptions and question them, to make sure that if we start on the right foot, that we have a good chance of going in the right direction. But if we don't know what they are, we don't question them, then that's where we can make mistakes. And then similar to the sort of quantitative emphasis, we like to rely on experts. Anytime, especially organizations, if they have some problems, they'll call in an expert, or consultant to help them to understand how they can, proceed in the future. Well, there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, that's oftentimes can be very helpful to a number of organizations. But the problem is that if you just rely on experts and you don't really consult your staff, the people who actually work for you, the labor, what are their beliefs, what are their hopes, what are their fears about the future, within your organization, then again, it's a kind of blindness. It's an internal factors that could very well derail your plans for the future because you just didn't consider them. You didn't consult them. You didn't, and this is typical, I think, a problem of management, So, of course, experts should be, consulted, but not only experts. You have to pay attention to the internal nature of your own organization, and that means the people, your human resources. Okay. Well, as a way of concluding about the typical approaches, I think what we can find the biggest thing is that the missing pieces, and what's missing in the traditional approaches to the future are often as important or even more important than what's included. So it's what you deny, what you ignore, that can really have a great impact on what happens in the future and take you by surprise. And that surprise could be fatal. So to give an example, typically when people talk about economics, there's a tendency to look at it in a very narrow way. It's kind of a tunnel vision and completely oblivious to the ecosystem or the biosphere in which economics activity takes place. And if you just ignore that, eventually you're going to run into some very serious problems economically, because we are dependent upon, this is our life system. We are dependent upon the biosphere and the ecosystem. So it has to be considered in the strategy process. So the way that we can find the missing pieces, to explore them, is that we have to consider alternative frameworks of analysis that challenge our assumptions about the future. Now, this is an overview presentation, so I can't go into each of these in much detail. There are whole courses that are taught in these areas. They are systems thinking integral futures is based on integral theory and causal layered analysis. Actually, systems thinking is also based on general systems theory. So, first of all, I just want to take a look at, let's take a look at systems thinking, and I just want to go over some key points. First of all, systems thinking, as I said, is based on general systems theory. It's been around for a while, for a few decades, also related to chaos theory. And it's a discipline to investigate and reveal the structures that underlie complex situations and organizations. Because if we understand the structure, then we can understand much more about the behavior. And it makes a huge difference. And another key point is that, which is related to chaos theory, by the way, the control isn't possible. You will always have some element of randomness or chaos, and we just have to learn how to live with it, how to navigate through it, to manage it, the best we can. But you will never reach absolute control. And that should not be your goal, to reach absolute control. What better way of looking at it is to try to increase your influence and your leverage in any given situation or organization, in its environment. And rather than looking at the sort of one-dimensional cause and effect chains, look for the interrelationships. How are different factors related to each other? And rather than cause and effect chains. In other words, recognize the synergy. This is the qualitative dimension, by the way. The synergy. What's not seen and yet, which is quite evident, is dynamic. What's dynamic in the relationship, that's the synergy, the chemistry in the interrelationships. So, you see processes of change, not just snapshots, but investigate how processes are continually in play, bringing about change. Again, qualitative rather than quantitative. And one key maxim, you might say, really, in systems thinking, is that structure determines behavior. If you want to understand behavior, you need to understand the underlying structure. Because behavior is a manifestation of the structure. I use this actually when I teach writing. I help students to understand how, grammatical structure, sentence structure is important, because if you understand that, how it works, how the structure works, then you can change your behavior, and your writing behavior, in other words, and you can improve it. You can modify it. And also that, and this is important, I think, sorry, back to here, where was I? Yeah. The most influential changes that can facilitate the development both of ourselves and our environment is within our own mind. In order to change, to bring about the best development and improvement, we have to change our mind. We have to change the way we look at things. And this can have a great impact, So this also has to do with the paradigm, being able to see with fresh eyes, not approaching a problem with the same mind that created the problem. Then I talk about the emergence of the 21st century mind in that sense, to be able to deal with the mega crisis, multifaceted mega crisis of the 21st century. We will not be able to overcome that challenge with the 20th century mind. It's going to take a 21st century mind to do that. That will be a different mind that can influence changes and facilitate the development of ourselves and our environment. So, just to give a more concrete example, though, let's take a look at management and the difference that systems thinking can make in terms of management. For one thing, now, for example, the old style of management is that of the industrial age, so to speak, is by objectives only. Establish your objectives, and then your company and your employees need to meet those objectives. And it's very short-term focused, and with using separate and isolated context. And it's hierarchical. It's got a pyramid structure. And it's very empirical, quantitative oriented, analytic. The total equals sum of parts, and that's it. Nothing else is considered. And it's the management imperative is to meet its organizational specifications, which are in the very design of the organization. And so that's it. And then the system is a very adversarial. Employees compete against each other, for reward, or recognition. That's pretty much some key points about the old style, you might say industrial sort of style of management. Now let's see the difference that systems thinking can bring into this this approach. How radically different the approach is. Instead of management by objectives only, we don't just, in other words, allow for improvement, allow for flexibility, allow for flow, allow for adaptation in time through process, continuous improvement, not only objectives, but something that can change as time goes by, that has the ability to adapt. And not only short-term, but long-term focus. And not just looking at things in separate, isolated contexts, but how does every component relate to each other? The interrelated context. And how does this relate to the whole system, rather than, this separate, isolated context? And rather than a pyramid structure, it's more of a network structure with systems. And it's more holistic rather than analytic. In other words, it recognizes the qualitative dimension, in which case synergy is a very important factor. The total is not equal to the sum of parts, but it's more than the sum of parts. And rather than just strictly meeting pre-designed organizational specifications in the systems orientation, you meet customer needs in real time. As time progresses, you understand customers' needs, you research their needs, and you see how customer needs are changing, and you adapt to customers' needs as time goes by. And rather than an adversarial merit system, the emphasis is on team cooperation. Okay, so I want to turn now to another alternative framework that of analysis to help discover the missing pieces. And besides systems thinking, another method that has been has gained a lot of traction in future studies in the last decade or so is that of causal layered analysis. And this is a four-layered analysis of looking at things where you have the sort of iceberg metaphor where you see at the tip there is what you see, the problem, as it's usually described in the media. It's the litany, the official public description of an issue, any issue. And in terms of the time, its time scale now, that this is the present. You know, what's happening today, current events, the bits and blips of media and the media spin, opinions, policy, and it's continuous. Okay, so we're all very familiar with this. But what often gets left out is there are many, as you notice, there are many layers, and beneath any present issue, there is a history. There are causes, you know, and these take place over years. Social, economic, technological, sometimes, you know, environmental, political, cultural, to some extent. They start connecting with systems analysis, social analysis, you know, policy analysis, and so on. We find this in this social science journals, so academic areas or, you know, publications that give a little bit deeper insight into that particular issue. But underneath that is a third layer that's usually not really visible to most, and this is something that takes place over decades. You know, it's the worldview, the ideology, perspective, paradigm, so to speak. And the typical way of investigation into worldviews is what's called discourse analysis, which is largely came out through postmodernism. Looks at culture and much deeper culture, and the values that are shared in the culture, the language that's being used, you know, and spiral dynamics, looks at memes, and you know, also investigates alternative worldviews. Now you might think, well, that's pretty deep. Couldn't possibly get any deeper, could it? But yes, there is another level that's very deep indeed. It is the societal or civilizational level that we can investigate only through myths and metaphors. This is like, for example, the era that you live in. Let's say the modern era. It takes place over several decades. I mean, several centuries, sorry. Centuries. And it is a very, you know, there may not be words for it, in fact, you know. I mean, these are the deep assumptions. It's kind of instinctual to our own identity. But you can see it's quite different, though. For example, if we compare the modern era with the Middle Ages, or Middle Ages with the ancient society, you know, the myths and the metaphors that are used are quite different. But yeah, these can be discovered through Carl Jung, Jungian archetypes, ancient bedrock stories. It's very instinctual, emotional responses. You know, very unconscious. We're not very conscious of this at all. And there may not be words for it, so it's through images, or visual, you know. There's a lot more that can be said about causal layered analysis, and will say more about it in another lecture, you know. But this is just an overview, just kind of understand how we can find the missing pieces through these 4 layers, you know, of analysis. And so that brings me to now another alternative framework that also has gained a lot of traction in future studies, and it's based on integral theory, and it's a 4-quadrant matrix, and the upper, for example, the upper quadrants here relate to the individual, and on the left-hand quadrants here take into consideration the more qualitative dimensions of the personal and the cultural, whereas the right-hand quadrants over here relate to the you know, external phenomena, stuff that can be quantified, through science, for example. And then the left, also the bottom quadrants are that of the group. So we have the individual in the group, and the interior and the exterior. So it's much more holistic. For example, the individual exterior is really with what we look in terms of behavior. What are the actions? What kind of what's being manifested, the work that one does. Whereas on the qualitative side, the interior, the more subjective side, and the exterior is objective, so we can put a number on it, in other words. But on the interior, we can't. It's qualitative. It's like consciousness, being, the values that you have, even religion and artistic, impulses. It would be all on the interior. Spirituality, I should say. And then if we look at the bottom quadrants, the lower quadrants, I should say, on the left side, there is the cultural. This is the good, as Plato would say. What do we share? What values do we share as a society, as a community, or as a tribe? And also what are our morals, the morals that we have, that we believe in, so in the ethics, this also goes into ethics and law. But then on the right-hand side, external, this is actually the plural of the individual. This is individuals, in systems. There's social systems, institutions, organizations, and so on that we can see in the world, So, the manifestations of our collective conscious. So anyway, the integral framework is very fascinating, and it has a lot of, it gives a lot of insight, and very holistic, and it can be very valuable framework, for uncovering some of those missing pieces, as we say. Now, in fact, for example, applying this to organizational dynamics, you can see, organization on the upper left is the individual organization's consciousness, whereas on the upper right would be the organization's behavior. Then the lower left would be the culture of that organization, and the lower right is the systems of the organization. So, and then also these arrows, like the yellow arrow being the growth dynamics in each quadrant, and the green arrow being the integrative, dynamics. It's that which holds the organization together, structurally speaking. And then you have the red arrows that are this sort of cycle dynamics, as it changes through time. So those three frameworks are really interesting. The systems thinking and causal layered analysis and integral theory, which we can also apply to future studies, say integral futures, is very valuable, holistic frameworks through which you kind of get a much clearer picture, of just about anything really you can apply it to, to investigations and understanding from a more holistic, and generally just more holistic perspective. Okay, so I'd like to draw your attention now to the generic foresight process. If you ask the question, well, what is foresight, and how does it work? Well, this is a simple and brilliant, really, explanation of how foresight, what is foresight and how it works, step by step. So, where do we begin? First of all, stuff is happening. Things are happening all around us. That's our environment, the stuff that's happening. And that's where we apply environmental scanning. We want to know what's happening. And and immediately, this is when our mind confronts this phenomena, stuff happening, then we begin to apply analysis. We ask ourselves, well, what seems to be happening? And that's the first step of the foresight. There's 3 steps, actually: analysis, interpretation, prospection. So we ask, well, we say, well, what seems to be happening? So we're trying to make sense of stuff that's happening. And immediately when we ask that question, I think the interpretation follows. We want to know, well, what's really happening? I mean, what difference does it make? I mean, why is it important? How is it meaningful? And especially regarding the future, or futures. You know, how can we? What implications are there of this? You know, this happening. And so we make some value judgments. And when we interpret, we have to judge what's important. There's so much stuff happening. It's data overload. We have to make sense of it, and we have to decide, well, is this important or not, especially regarding the future. And of course, this is where some mistakes. There's a subjective element to it, and where some mistakes can be made. You might leave out stuff that's happening that really is important, but you just didn't think it was, and later it turns out it was. But you know, this is unavoidable. I mean, you have the same problem with history. You have to decide, you know, stuff that happened, well, what's important, what has meaning, you know, what's valuable, you know, about stuff that happened, and what isn't, you know, what gets neglected. It's true. So, and the same thing applies to the future studies. But anyway, you decide what's really important, and then after that, you have to ask the question, well, as a result of this, what are the implications? You know, what might happen then, you know, from this, you know, projecting into the future. And immediately, when you do that, you get into, beyond foresight, into strategy. What might we need to do? That's the output, right? As a result, what do we need to do in order to respond to possible, probable futures, and also to have develop a strategy to desirable futures, preferred futures, you know, as a result of you know, what has happened and the implications. So, and that leads immediately to our strategy. Well, what are we going to do? You know, what are we going to do, and how are we going to do it? So that's just an overview, like I said, generic foresight process, but it really is, I think, very insightful as to understanding foresight and how it works. And if we want to apply this to, say, more academic, you know, like foresight methods that have been developed, specific methods that have been developed in response to each of these steps. I want to turn the attention now to the description of this exact, you know, the generic foresight process in the book The Future, A Very Short Introduction by Jennifer Gidley. So let's, I'm going to play that now to help understand, again, how this is applied to foresight methods.
Input methods are essentially about gathering information. This can be achieved through workshops, online questionnaires, and organizational interviews. The typical methods for obtaining information prior to analysis or strategy development are environmental or horizontal scanning, the future scan method, the Delphi method, surveys, and technology assessment. Analytic methods are primarily concerned with meaning making. Now, one of the characteristics of analysis from a futures lens is that it provides new perspectives on received wisdom by unpacking the present view of things. Analytic methods can include emerging issues analysis, trend analysis and extrapolation, cross-impact analysis, pattern recognition, discourse and text analysis, and dialogue. Slaughter's third cluster is paradigmatic methods, which Boros called interpretive or depth methods. Through interpretive methods, we gain deeper insights into the information that has already been gathered and analyzed. Interpretive methods that arise from futures research include Galtong's macro history, and Tula's causal layered analysis. And beyond future studies, we find systems thinking, hermeneutics, and mixed methods such as bricolage, which all can be used to deepen futures understanding. Wilber's integral methodological approach, integral operating system, is used in the integral futures approach. Ethnography, media critique, and study of cultural artifacts can also be incorporated into futures work. The fourth cluster of iterative and exploratory methods is, according to Voros, aligned to prospective methods that seek to produce future images. Mazzini's utopian visionary perspective aspires to transform the present by a vision of the future. And some obvious exploratory prospective methods include visioning, both individual and collaborative, imagination and creativity, scenario planning and backcasting, which is reverse planning from the future vision back to the present. Prospective methods include an activism component, like Boulding's vision axis action nexus. In this slide, I include three futures methods that are often overlooked: action research, action learning, and participatory futures workshops.
Now, the next slide here, grasping global change drivers, illustrates the difference that foresight can make in any organization. So let's say you're in a particular business, for example, and your business is situated within an industry. Now, you know a lot about that industry. You wouldn't be in that profession if you didn't. I mean, that's the reason why you go to a university, is to get some background information and other relevant, everything that's relevant to the industry that you work in. And that's why you were selected, one of the main reasons anyway, why you were selected to work in that industry, in your profession. And the same goes with all your competitors. They all belong to that same industry, and they all have a very similar background and education that you do. And so their perspective, you share pretty much the same perspective that they do. There's not a whole lot of difference in that. So what can make the difference? What can give you the advantage over your competitor? Well, one of the things is the difference that foresight makes. And how is foresight used? It's used in an area that impacts your industry, which in turn impacts your organization, that your competitors may not be aware of. And that is the global drivers of change. And that's where the strategic scanning takes place, because those global drivers of change are happening at the global level, and they are shaping the change that you see in your industry. So if you're aware of them, if you're aware of the global drivers of change, then you will know about some of the threats to your industry and also the opportunities that lie, that will shape your industry in the future. And this knowledge can help you and your organization to thrive in the future. It gives you one advantage over your competitors that can make a big difference, to your survival, especially as corporations or businesses are continually rising and falling. This can be one great advantage that you have. Okay, now let's see. Yeah, this next slide, seeing, thinking, doing. It really is very similar to the generic foresight process, where you see three stages. First of all, seeing. That involves the stuff that's out there, and you have to try to grasp all the stuff that's out there that's relevant through a method called environmental scanning. And by the way, we will explore this and use this method in the future in our class. And this is how you can deepen your understanding of relevant change to you or the organization that you happen to be employed in. And then the next step then is to make sense of the stuff that's out there, and that's where your analysis and interpretation comes in, which in the general category here, thinking, interpreting the implications, and when you do that, you begin to identify the alternative futures, which is prospection, that I mentioned earlier. And from that, then you decide on what kind of action will be taken. So this is all part of methods that are related to strategic thinking. And then beyond thinking, then you have to do something. There has to be some, basis for, pragmatic action. How are you going to, what are the results and how are you going to respond to it? So you have to implement action, and you have to then align the organization in accordance, and that's strategic planning. Okay, now I mentioned, continually I've been mentioning about possible, probable, and desirable futures. And regarding preferable futures, how can you, what are some of the techniques that are used to do that? There are a variety of techniques, really. What is it? It's your preferred future. The mission statement. In other words, a lot of times organizations or businesses will have a mission statement, and this is what they want in the future. What kind of future do you want for your organization? You need to have a vision of the future, and this is usually developed after you explore. Once you just don't do it from scratch, but you have to kind of research what are the possible and probable futures, and then on that basis, then you can begin to construct your mission statement about what your organization wants. How you're going to respond to these with the best possible future. And it is long-term, and it is aspirational and stable, because it continually pulls people into the future. Because it can be a powerful force to motivate the people in your organization. So the best way, you want to talk about predicting the future, well, the best way is to create it, make it happen. As the saying goes, build it and they will come. So you begin by envisioning it. And one of the ways, too, that can be helpful in this process of envisioning the future and for understanding, really, in general, the possibilities, alternative futures, is through scenario construction. It's a very, actually, popular method in future studies field. There are a lot of different methods, actually, for this, or techniques, I should say. And this is just an overview of some of the more, predominant ones. But you noticed here on the slide, there are, for example, inductive and deductive techniques. These are very related, based on two types of reasoning. Inductive reasoning, where you have separate scenarios, alternative futures, and then deductive can follow as the basis of those scenarios. Then what can we conclude? What do they have in common, and so on. And then the incremental alternative scenarios, where you have your official future, which is the basically trend extrapolation, the baseline future. More or less, what we see patterns in the past, history, and we see trends that are emerging, and we then extrapolate those trends into the future. So it's pretty much business as usual. What has been going on, it will continue to go on in the future. But of course, we know that doesn't always happen. And so we have to think about what are some of the alternative scenarios. And largely, I think the alternative scenarios doesn't really come from history, but comes from the present. What's going on today? What's happening? And we try to find the weak signals, those things that maybe is being overlooked, which may not have a lot of attention today, but we think that could be a big player in the future. So that can be how the official future is impacted, and there could be an offshoot, and things could happen differently, and that could be different. And of course, that can lead to scenario development. And then finally, as I mentioned before about visioning, you have a mission statement, a vision of the future. So you want to know how can you what are the steps to get to that future that you want, your ideal, for your organization. And one of the techniques to use in that is called backcasting, where you look at this particular future that you this desired for you or your organization, and you begin to go backwards towards the present, to the present, and you look at all the steps. Going back, you look at all the steps, and then you can see how that you can apply it to your steps to get to that future. Okay, so that's scenarios, and here's an example. I think also I want to introduce you to a technique in future studies. It's called the futures wheel, and it's quite related to scenario construction, and I'll explain why or how. For one thing, okay, let's say this can be anything that's going on that you want to do. Let's say, for example, in a community, in the community or society wants to build a new highway. Well, you want to think about how's this going to affect people in that particular community in the future. Let's say 20 years into the future. How is this? What's going to happen as a result? So because we want to be prepared for this, so we brainstorm. It's really a brainstorming activity. What are the first order consequences, second order, third order, and so on. So, for example, the new highways, this proposal, new highway is going to be built. What does this mean? Well, for one thing, there are going to be new areas of congestion. New businesses will move in, which actually will cause new areas of congestion too. And there will be increased economic activity. And we can think of some others, perhaps, But based on those, that's just some suggestions for first order consequences. And then as a result of that, what will happen? Well, if you have increased activity, again, that will contribute to new areas of congestion, and housing prices will go up. And if new businesses move in, that will also impact new areas of congestion. And old networks will be then challenged. And new communities will be created. You see. And as a result of new areas of congestion, house prices will go down. Whereas in increased economic activity, house prices go up. And then we have the third order consequence, and so on. We can brainstorm, what will be the consequence of that, and the consequences of that. And so eventually what you get is a map of the future. All the different possibilities. And you can look at them and think about them and evaluate them, and how they relate to each other. That's the value of the future wheel. And on the basis, then, you can begin to construct scenarios. And it works vice versa, too. You can do the scenarios first and then use that as a basis to, for the futures wheel. In either way, it has there's a great dynamic there between the futures wheel and scenario construction. And so, what the futures wheel does is it seeks to develop the consequences of today's issues on the long-term future, helps anticipate future issues, and it creates possibilities for new products. It moves from seeing the world at a simple, unconnected level to a more complex, connected level. How the parts interact with the whole then becomes clearer because you have this map of the future, So it helps with your visioning as well. So this new highway proposal could affect a community, let's say, and that's what you're exploring, how it's going to affect a community 20 years from now. So first, economic activity may increase, which will lead to more jobs, therefore higher prices, right? And then this means that there will be more congestion as motorists are traveling on the road. But then, as a result of that, you could have more pollution, and that could lead to increased health problems. And the highway may change the locus of social networks to previously more isolated areas. And also, you could have a haves and have-not scenario if rapid growth continues at the expense of equity. So you begin to get an idea about what does this mean? What impact is it going to have in the future? And it can be very useful for social planning purposes. Okay, well that ends this part one of this Foresight Methods presentation, and I'll pick up then on next time with environmental scanning. So, thank you.